My goal in these lectures is not going to be to replace reading the book, okay? You need to read the book. If you don't want to, you're simply not going to get as much out of the lectures. Now, understand, if you don't read the book, nobody's going to call your parents. Nobody will put a black mark next to your name. In fact, I'm not even going to know, probably. But if our class discussions are going to be fruitful, if the lectures are going to be most helpful, then you're going to need to spend time with the book. That's just crucial. Not, again, because the book is a sacred text, but because it's the basis for our conversation. So I'm simply going to talk about some highlights. I'm going to talk about issues that I think are important. I'm going to talk sometimes about disagreements. I'm going to attempt on occasion to clarify what I think the Tannehills are up to. What I'm doing is designed to supplement, to augment what's there in the book. Okay, so what are the Tannehills up to in the readings for this class session? The answer is that they want to begin with a diagnosis before proceeding to offer a cure. And so what's the approach they take? Things are bad, the state is the reason they're bad, and anarchy is the answer. Okay? Things are bad. Why are they bad? They're bad because of the state. So what do? We get rid of the state. That's the Tannehills' approach here. Now, we need, they maintain, and I think they're very right, we need a positive alternative to government. If we don't offer one, the vacuum that emerges when the system collapses could be filled by a tyrant. And this is a point they make, I think, quite plausibly. If we simply tear down without building up at the same time, without building up alternatives, we really run the risk of something quite awful. Note the sense of impending collapse. Now, this book was published in 1970. So what kind of impending collapse was in the air? Well, of course, social protest was very much part of the American mainstream. This was the era of civil rights protests, of anti-war protests, of burgeoning feminism and gay rights movements. It was a time when all kinds of eternal verities were being challenged, in which young people were facing off quite aggressively against what they perceived as the uptight culture of older people. The old rules were being dissolved. And so that's the kind of collapse that seems to be imminent from the perspective of the Tannehills in 1970. But there's a sense in which the arguments that they offer are even more relevant today, when it's not just the legitimation of the state that's collapsing, the old rules, the sense that what's established, what's in place ought to be questioned, but actually the state's ability to fund itself. I mean, that's really a striking feature of what's happening today, certainly in the United States. The government is so overextended. It has borrowed so much to fund, in particular, an absurdly expensive war effort, and it has, at the same time, overextended itself in other ways that the financial crunch that we find ourselves in the middle of right now has really had dramatically unpleasant consequences for the state's ability to fund itself and to really maintain its viability. Here in California, from where I'm speaking, we're facing a huge state government budget crisis that I think is just representative of what's happening around the country. So where the Tannehills had one kind of collapse in mind, a collapse of support for the old rules, a collapse of support for the perceived legitimacy of existing social institutions, today we face the material substructure of the state in a state of collapse. Now, it's important to emphasize that the Tannehills, like all sensible anarchists, don't operate on the assumption that a stateless society will be viable only if people's motives are radically different than the ones people seem to have at present. This is a really crucial point. It is often alleged, when anarchist ideas are floated, it's often alleged that people who favor anarchism imagine a radical transformation in the underlying motives that are at the root of people's actions. And I think it's quite clear that while there's some variability, and people's motives certainly can be in one way or another reshaped by their environments, there are limits to the degree to which this is possible. And a project which presupposes minimal change in people's motives is for that reason going to be more viable, more credible, more defensible than one which assumes that the only way it's going to work is if there is this dramatic shift in people's motivations. So the Tannehills don't assume that. Instead, they recognize, I think quite truthfully, that because people aren't all benevolent, it's dangerous to give them access to the kind of power the state possesses. So I think this is really, really a crucial point. A frequent criticism of anarchism is that, well, you assume that people are benevolent. In fact, they're often quite greedy and selfish, and we need the state to restrain them. And the Tannehills very, very aptly respond, but wait a minute, if you really think people are fundamentally greedy, fundamentally selfish, fundamentally not to be trusted, why the heck give anyone the kind of power you want to give the state? If you really think that people aren't at some deep level not to be trusted with power, why trust the state with that kind of power? So the Tannehills, I think, very appropriately recognize that that's not a sensible option. Precisely because people aren't always trustworthy, it's important to spread power out as widely as possible. It's important for power to be shared as widely as possible so that no one person or group can get a hold of concentrated power and use it in destructive and abusive ways. So one way to see this book, one way to understand what the Tannehills are accomplishing, whether this is quite what they're intending is another matter, but one way to see what they're in fact accomplishing is to see the book not as offering a set of concrete blueprints for a stateless society, they do that, but rather as offering what we can call a possibility proof of the viability of such a society. Possibility proof, of course, says, how do I know that such and such is in fact possible? Because I can demonstrate the possibility. Here's what it would look like in practical terms for this to happen. So whether this approach is best or not isn't the key point. Rather, what matters is that this model shows the bare possibility of an alternative to the state. So then you can ask, could we do it better than the ways in which the Tannehills think we could do it? And the answer in some cases is surely going to be yes, but that's okay because what they've done still matters. They've succeeded at minimum in showing that an alternative to the state is possible. And that, I think, may be all that is needed to remove the state's legitimacy. Because so much of popular support for the state, even from very bright, critically reflective people, depends on the assumption that things would simply fall apart, that we would descend into chaos and violence. We couldn't coordinate our actions in a peaceful and cooperative manner without the sword of Leviathan hanging over our heads. If you can show that an alternative is possible, then I think you've accomplished something really valuable because you've undermined that underlying suspicion that the state really is essential. Okay, so how do the Tannehills proceed? How do they offer a basic justification for anarchism? So their approach is to ground a blueprint for a stateless society in what they see as inescapable features of human nature. The first of these, the one on which they begin to focus, is that humans live. Okay? Seems fairly straightforward. When we're talking about persons at all, we're talking about persons who are alive. No society is made out of corpses. Okay? So humans have the capacity to think and to make rational plans. They don't simply act out of instinct. On the other hand, however, using reason is a choice. I can just allow my life to be buffeted around by impulse, or I can think rationally. Now, the next moment in their argument is no one can choose for anyone else. Okay? I'm an agent, And as